The wind came from the northwest. It always did. By the time it crossed the open flats and hit the first line of ridges, it had already killed the temperature, dragged it down past minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and kept going. In the valleys below, settlers who had spent all summer building their cabins now watched the walls shake. Frost crept under the door frames. Firewood that was supposed to last 3 months was gone in 6 weeks. Some families burned their furniture before January was over. Every structure in that part of the territory suffered. Every one except one. It sat in a crack in the rock face, not beside it, not against it, inside it. From a distance, you could barely see it. Just a door, a thin column of smoke rising from somewhere deep in the stone, and nothing else. No exposed walls, no visible windows, just the crack, the smoke, and silence. The men who passed that ridge on their way to check on their own frozen livestock didn't stop to ask questions. They shook their heads and kept walking. One of them, according to a local account preserved in a county archive from that period, said something to the effect that the man living in that rock was either a fool or an animal. That no reasonable person would choose to live in a hole in the ground when there was perfectly good timber to be had. He was wrong, but he wouldn't understand why until spring. Something was happening inside that crevice that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with a decision made months earlier. A decision so quiet, so counterintuitive that most people walked right past the answer without ever seeing it. The cabin wasn't surviving the blizzards. It was making them irrelevant. If you've ever wondered why modern insulated homes still lose heat faster than some of the roughest shelters ever built on the American frontier, stay with this. Because what one man understood about stone, wind, and cold in the winter of 1886 is something most builders today have never been taught. If this kind of forgotten frontier engineering is what you're here for, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Montana Territory, autumn of 1885. The sky in that part of the country does something in late October that settlers from the east were never quite prepared for. It doesn't gradually darken or slowly cool. It simply closes like a lid dropping over the world. 1 week there is color, the smell of dry grass, the last warmth carried on wind from the south. The next week there is nothing but gray and cold, and the particular silence that comes when everything alive has either fled or gone aground. The region stretched across a series of high ridges and open valleys carved by glaciers 10,000 years before the first homesteaders arrived. Elevation ranged between 4,200 and 5,800 feet above sea level, depending on where you stood. The winters regularly drove temperatures down past minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit for stretches of 2 to 3 weeks at a time. Wind was not an occasional visitor. It was a permanent resident, sweeping off the Continental Divide and funneling through every exposed valley with an efficiency that seemed almost deliberate. The settlers who came here in the early 1880s were not timid people. They had survived long journeys, bad harvests, and uncertain ground. But Montana in winter was a different kind of problem. It was not a test of courage. It was a test of physics. The land offered timber, lodgepole pine mostly, with some spruce and fir at higher elevations. It offered stone in abundance. Limestone outcroppings, granite shelves, sandstone faces laid bare by centuries of erosion. It offered water from snowmelt creeks and, in summer, good grass for cattle. What it did not offer was mercy. The margin between a well-prepared homestead and a failed one could be measured in degrees, sometimes as few as 10 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And the difference between those degrees was usually a construction decision made the previous spring, when everything still seemed manageable. By the mid-1880s, a loose string of small communities had taken shape along the valley floors and lower ridge lines. Families built within reasonable distance of one another, sharing labor when they could, trading what little surplus the land allowed. The social fabric was thin but real. People knew their neighbors. They noticed when smoke stopped rising from a chimney. They noticed when a family's woodpile shrank too fast in November. And they noticed in the autumn of 1885 when one man chose to do something that no one around him had ever seen done before or thought worth doing. His name, according to fragmentary records kept by a local land office in that period, appears to have been Callum Dreist, a man of Scottish and Irish descent, somewhere in his early 40s, who had arrived in the territory 2 seasons prior after a decade of working in the copper mines of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. He was not a carpenter by trade. He was not a trained builder of any kind, but he had spent years underground, and underground, as he would later explain to anyone willing to listen, the rock did not care about the weather. Callum Dreist spent his first full season in Montana not building. He watched. That choice, to observe before constructing, to wait before committing, would eventually cost him the mockery of half the valley. And it would save his life. To understand what Callum Dreist eventually did, you first have to understand what everyone else was doing and why it made a kind of desperate, obvious sense given the circumstances. The standard frontier cabin of the Montana Territory in the 1880s followed a pattern that had been carried west from the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region over the course of 2 generations. It was not a bad design. For the forests of Indiana or the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, it worked well enough. But it had been born in a climate that was fundamentally different from the northern Rockies, and by the time it arrived in Montana, it carried assumptions baked into its structure that the land would eventually expose as fatal. The typical construction went like this. A settler would clear a flat, accessible piece of ground, usually in a valley, close to water, sheltered from nothing in particular. He would cut and notch lodgepole pine logs into walls roughly 12 to 14 feet on a side, with gaps chinked using a mixture of clay, dry grass, and whatever fibrous material was on hand. The roof will be a simple ridgeline structure covered with split wood, sod, or bark, depending on availability. A single fireplace or cast iron stove would be positioned somewhere near the center of the main room, with a chimney rising straight through the roof. This design had one fundamental logic driving it: get heat into the air as fast as possible. A central stove radiates warmth in all directions. It heats the room quickly when it burns, and the settlers assumed that was the goal, to feel warm fast. The problem was what happened when the fire went low. In a standard Montana cabin of that era, with log walls 12 inches thick and minimal thermal mass beyond the stove itself, the interior temperature could drop from a comfortable 65 degrees Fahrenheit to below 30 degrees Fahrenheit in as little as 4 to 6 hours after the fire died down. Oral accounts collected by county historians in later decades describe families waking before dawn to find water frozen solid in buckets, placed less than 8 feet from a bank stove. Children sleeping in lofts would sometimes wake with frost on their blankets. The wood consumption required to maintain warmth through a Montana winter in one of these standard cabins was staggering. Local records from general stores in the area suggest that an average family of 4 could burn through 4 to 5 cords of firewood between November and March, sometimes more during severe cold snaps. A cord of wood represents roughly 128 cubic feet of stacked timber. Cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking 5 cords of wood on top of every other labor demand of frontier life was not a trivial undertaking. It was an exhausting year-round commitment just to stay alive through winter. And yet the structure itself contributed almost nothing to retaining the heat it consumed. The thin log walls bled warmth steadily. The single-layer roof, often poorly insulated, lost heat upward through convection. The chinking, no matter how carefully applied, cracked and shrank in the cold, opening small gaps that let cold air draft inward at floor level. The fireplace, or stove, burning hard to compensate, drew enormous volumes of cold outside air through every imperfection in the structure to feed its combustion. The house was not a container for heat. It was a machine for consuming wood. Callum Dreist understood this intuitively, though he could not have explained it in the language of thermodynamics. What he understood came from years underground, where the temperature inside a mine shaft 10 feet below the surface barely varied between summer and winter, not because of anything anyone built, but because of the rock itself. The rock absorbed energy slowly and released it slowly. It didn't spike and crash the way air did. It didn't care about wind. It didn't care about night. He stood at the edge of his claimed land in the spring of 1885 and looked at the ridge above him. He looked at the exposed log cabins in the valley below. and he thought about what the rock knew that the wood didn't. The other settlers in that valley built as soon as the ground thawed. March if the weather allowed. April at the latest. Every week of construction completed before summer was a week gained against the coming winter, or so the logic went. Speed was the currency of survival on the frontier. A man who wasn't building was a man who was falling behind. Callum Dreist did not build in the spring of 1885. He did not build in the summer. He moved into a lean-to structure, barely more than a pitched roof of bark and pine boughs, open on two sides, and spent the season observing. His neighbors thought he had lost his nerve. A few said so openly. One account, preserved in a journal kept by a neighboring homesteader, a man named Ernest Pratt, notes that the general opinion in the valley that summer was that the man in the lean-to had come too far and seen too much strangeness in the mining camps and had lost his sense of proper order. Pratt himself wrote that he offered twice to help Callum raise a proper cabin before the season turned, and that both times the offer was politely declined without explanation. What Callum was actually doing during those months was something that today would be called site analysis, though he had no name for it and no formal training in it. He was watching the land behave. He watched the wind, not where it came from in general. Everyone knew it came from the northwest, but specifically how it moved through the terrain. He noticed that the valley floor, where most of the cabins sat, acted as a channel. The ridges on either side compressed the airflow, accelerating it through the low ground. A fire burning in the valley threw sparks nearly horizontal on bad nights. The same wind, 50 feet higher on the ridge face, was broken and deflected by the rock outcroppings. In certain spots along the upper ridge line, he could stand in near-perfect calm while the trees in the valley below bent under the gust. He watched the snow. He noted where it accumulated and where it didn't. On exposed slopes, the wind scoured the ground bare, leaving rock. In certain crevices and alcoves along the ridge face, snow built up in deep, undisturbed drifts. Not because more snow fell there, but because those spaces were sheltered enough that the wind could not displace what landed. That same shelter, he reasoned, would apply to cold air and heat loss in equal measure. He watched the rock itself. In late summer, when the afternoon sun hit the south-facing granite faces of the upper ridge, those surfaces held warmth well into the evening, sometimes past 10 at night. He tested this by pressing his palms flat against the stone after sunset, when the air was already cooling sharply. The rock was still warm, not dramatically, but measurably, consistently warm, radiating stored energy back into the air the way a banked fire radiates from its coals long after the flames have gone out. Thermal mass. The principle has a modern name and a set of engineering formulas attached to it today, but the concept is ancient. Dense materials, stone, brick, rammed earth, packed clay, absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. They do not respond to temperature spikes the way air does. They average out the extremes. A thick stone wall heated during the day will continue giving off warmth through the night, long after the heat source is removed. The more mass, the longer the release. The more surface area in contact with the living space, the more effective the transfer. Callum did not have the formula, but he had his hands pressed against warm granite at 11 o'clock on a September night, and he had a miner's understanding of what rock does when you give it time. By October of 1885, he had found the place he was looking for. It was a crevice on the north-facing side of the upper ridge, which sounds counterintuitive and was exactly the kind of detail that would later cause the valley men to shake their heads. The crevice ran roughly 8 feet wide at its narrowest navigable point and perhaps 30 feet deep into the rock face before it widened into a natural alcove approximately 16 feet across and 12 feet high. The opening faced slightly east of due south, an orientation that would catch the low winter sun without exposing a large surface to the northwest wind. The wind that tore through the valley below barely whispered at the entrance of that crack. Callum Dreist spent October measuring, planning, and gathering material. He didn't tell anyone what he was building. He didn't need to. By the time the first snow fell, word had traveled through the valley on its own, and it was not accompanied by admiration. The news moved the way news always moved in isolated frontier communities, slowly at first, then all at once. By early November of 1885, most of the men in the valley had either heard directly from Callum Dreyest what he was planning, or had heard it secondhand from someone who had. Either way, the reaction was remarkably consistent. A crevice in the rock face, north-facing ridge, no flat ground to speak of, no room to expand, no way to bring a wagon close enough to haul supplies in winter. Just a crack in the stone, a man with a plan, and what everyone around him agreed was a fundamental misunderstanding of how shelter was supposed to work. Ernest Pratt, whose journal remains one of the more detailed accounts of that community during this period, recorded the general sentiment plainly. The feeling among most of us was that he had chosen the worst possible site for a winter dwelling, dark, cramped, and buried so deep in the rock that no sensible amount of light would reach it. A man building there was not building a home. He was digging a grave with a door. The objections were not merely aesthetic. They were practical, and some of them were made by men with genuine building experience. The first and most common argument was drainage. A crevice in a rock face, the critics pointed out, would funnel snow melt and rainwater directly into the living space during the spring thaw. Without proper grading and drainage channels, difficult to achieve in solid rock, the floor would turn to mud or standing water every March. A standard valley cabin, built on graded earth with a slight slope away from the walls, handled this naturally. The second objection was light. The crevice faced slightly south, yes, but the narrow opening and deep alcove meant that direct sunlight would penetrate the interior for only a limited window each day, even in summer. In winter, when the sun tracked low across the southern horizon, the interior would be dim for most of the daylight hours. Candles and lamp oil were not unlimited resources on the frontier. The third objection was the most technical, and it came from a builder named Josiah Crane, who had constructed 7 cabins in the valley over the previous 4 years and was considered by most to be the closest thing to a professional the community had. Crane's argument was about combustion. A stove or fireplace, he explained, required a steady draft, a column of rising warm air drawing fresh combustion air in from outside. In an open valley setting, this worked naturally. In a deep crevice, with restricted airflow and an irregular opening, the draft could become unpredictable. The fire could backdraft. Smoke could fill the interior. A man could suffocate in his own shelter. These were not foolish objections. They reflected real knowledge about real problems. And Callum listened to all of them, patiently, without visible irritation, and then continued preparing his site. He did not argue with Josiah Crane. He did not publish a rebuttal to Ernest Pratt's skepticism. He simply kept working, moving stone, measuring the alcove interior, and making calculations that no one in the valley fully understood because he had not explained them yet. What Callum understood, and what his critics did not, was that every one of their objections addressed a problem of a conventional cabin placed in an unconventional location. They were right that a standard structure in that crevice would fail. But he was not building a standard structure. He was building something the crevice itself was already half-finished constructing, something that worked with the rock rather than merely resting against it. He addressed the drainage concern by cutting a shallow channel along the base of the crevice floor on both sides, directing any water that entered toward a single exit point at the front threshold, a technique he had learned from mine shaft maintenance in Michigan, where water management underground was a constant and serious problem. He addressed the light concern practically. He did not need the crevice to be bright. He needed it to be warm and survivable. Those were different requirements, and only one of them mattered when the temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Josiah Crane's concern about draft, however, was the one Callum took most seriously. It was also the one he had thought about the longest. The answer was in the geometry of the crevice itself, but it would take a winter blizzard to prove it. If you've been following along, and this is the kind of history that actually teaches you something, hit like and subscribe. We're just getting to the part where he starts to build, and the choices he made inside that rock are going to surprise you. Construction began in earnest in the first week of November 1885, with the first hard freeze already setting the ground and the window for serious outdoor work closing fast. From the outside, what Callum was doing looked almost absurdly minimal. He was not raising walls. He was not notching logs or hauling timber up the ridge in quantity. He brought some lumber, a modest amount by valley standards, but most of what he carried up to the crevice was not building material in the conventional sense. It was stone, flat slabs of sandstone, pulled from a natural exposure roughly 200 yards from the crevice entrance, each piece averaging between 40 and 80 pounds. He moved them alone, on a sled he had rigged from bent pine, over the course of 3 weeks. By the time the valley men had tallied up what he was hauling, the estimate ran to somewhere between 3,500 and 4,200 pounds of sandstone before a single log had been placed. That number confused people. It would have been the first thing that made Josiah Crane pause, had he known the full figure at the time. Here is what Callum was building, stripped to its essential logic. The crevice already provided 2 walls. The rock faces on either side, each between 4 and 7 feet thick, continuous from floor to ceiling and extending deep into the ridge. These were not walls he needed to construct. They were walls that had been standing for 10,000 years and would continue standing indefinitely. Their thermal mass was effectively unlimited. His job was to connect them, enclose the space, and harness what they already were. He built a front facade, the only true constructed wall in the entire structure, from a combination of the smaller sandstone slabs and a modest frame of lodgepole pine. This facade was no more than 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall, fitted carefully into the narrowest navigable point of the crevice entrance, with a single door slightly offset from center and one small window, south-facing, positioned deliberately low to capture the angle of winter sunlight. The window opening was small, roughly 14 inches wide and 10 inches tall, and fitted with a removable wooden shutter backed with a layer of oiled animal hide, which admitted diffuse light while blocking wind infiltration. The roof presented a different kind of challenge. The crevice above the alcove was not fully enclosed. There was a narrow gap of open sky visible from inside, running along the top of the crack for perhaps 12 feet. Callum solved this by building a low-pitched roof of pine logs laid across the width of the crevice at a height of about 7.5 feet, then covering them with a thick layer of sod, grasses, roots, and packed earth, roughly 14 inches deep. The sod layer added additional thermal mass overhead and, critically, shed water during spring meld away from the interior rather than into it. The interior dimensions of the finished space were compact, approximately 15 feet deep, 9 feet wide at the widest point, and 7.5 feet from floor to roof. That is roughly 135 square feet of living space, smaller than a standard single-car garage today. But square footage was not the metric that mattered here. What mattered was the ratio of exposed surface area to thermal mass. And on that measure, Callum's cabin was unlike anything else in the valley. In a standard log cabin of the period, 16 feet by 14 feet, roughly 900 square feet of wall, floor, and ceiling surface were in contact with the exterior environment, losing heat continuously to the outside air. The only mass retaining heat was the stove itself and whatever stone had been used in its construction, typically 200 to 400 pounds at most. In Callum's crevice cabin, the 2 rock walls, each measuring roughly 30 feet long, 7 feet tall, and 4 to 7 feet thick, represented somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 pounds of continuous stone mass in direct thermal contact with the living space. The single constructed wall at the front, 8 feet wide, 7 feet tall, was the only surface losing heat to the outside air. Every other surface was solid rock. He positioned the stove, a small cast-iron box stove he had acquired from a trading post the previous summer, not at the center of the room, but deep in the alcove, pressed against the back wall of the crevice. This was another choice that puzzled anyone who thought about it in conventional terms. A central stove heats the air around it. A stove placed against a massive stone wall does something more. It heats the stone. The principle at work is simple. Cast iron at operating temperature, typically between 400 degrees Fahrenheit and 600 degrees Fahrenheit, radiates heat aggressively. A significant portion of that radiant energy is absorbed by any dense material in direct contact or close proximity. The sandstone back wall, absorbing that energy hour after hour during the evening burn, would reach temperatures well above the ambient room temperature and then release that energy slowly, over 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours, long after the fire had been reduced to coals. He was not heating the air. He was charging the rock. Josiah Crane's concern about draft, it turned out, had a built-in solution Callum had understood from the beginning. The crevice, narrow and deep, created a natural chimney effect. Warm air rising from the stove at the back of the alcove was drawn forward and upward through the narrowing of the crevice entrance, creating a consistent, predictable draft that actually improved combustion efficiency compared to many open valley chimneys, which were subject to wind reversal during strong northwest gusts. In a conventional valley cabin, a hard northwest wind could push cold air back down the chimney, flooding the firebox and filling the room with smoke. In the crevice, the prevailing wind was deflected by the rock above the entrance and could not reach the chimney opening directly. The draft held steady regardless of what the weather was doing outside. By late November, the structure was complete. Callum Dreist moved his few possessions inside, built the first fire in the back wall stove, and waited. The valley waited too, though not with the same patience and not for the same thing. December of 1886 arrived early and without negotiation. The first significant cold event hit the territory in the second week of the month. A sustained Arctic air mass that dropped temperatures across the valley floor to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit within 48 hours and held them there for 11 consecutive days. Wind chill on the exposed ridge tops pushed the effective temperature closer to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit during the worst nights. Local accounts from that period describe cattle found frozen, standing in fields, creeks locked solid to the bottom in places, and the sound of lodgepole pines cracking in the cold, a sharp, rifle-shot noise that carried for half a mile in the still air. This was not yet the famous catastrophic winter of 1886 to 1887 that historians would later call the Great Die-Up. The freeze that would ultimately destroy up to 90% of the open-range cattle herds across Montana and Wyoming and fundamentally reshape the livestock industry of the American West. That full disaster was still weeks away. What arrived in December was a preview, brutal enough on its own, and more than sufficient to begin separating the structures that worked from those that didn't. In the valley below Callum's Ridge, the standard cabins did what standard cabins did. They held, technically, no roofs collapsed, no walls failed structurally, but the interior conditions deteriorated sharply. Ernest Pratt's journal from that December records burning through more than half a cord of wood in a single week during the worst stretch of cold, and still waking each morning to interior temperatures below 38 degrees Fahrenheit near the floor. He writes of hanging additional blankets across the interior doorways to divide the space. Try to maintain survivable warmth in a single room rather than attempting to heat the full cabin. He writes of his wife sleeping in her outdoor coat. Pratt also records, with evident curiosity and a hint of something he does not quite name, that he hiked up to the crevice on the 5th day of the cold snap to check on his neighbor. He expected to find Callum struggling. He found him eating breakfast. The interior of the crevice cabin, Pratt wrote, was warmer by a considerable degree than my own house, and my own house had a fire burning when I left it. He estimated, without a thermometer, from feel alone, that the interior was somewhere between 52 degrees Fahrenheit and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The stove at the back of the alcove had been banked down to coals for several hours. There was no active fire. The rock walls, he noted, were warm to the touch along their full length. When Pratt asked Callum how much wood he had burned to maintain that warmth through the cold stretch, the answer required clarification. He had burned roughly a third of a cord in 5 days. Pratt had burned more than twice that amount in the same period in a cabin that was still colder. The disparity was significant enough to record, and Pratt did. What was happening physically inside that crevice during those days is explicable through straightforward thermal principles. The sandstone walls, charged nightly by the back wall stove over the preceding weeks, had accumulated a substantial thermal reserve. Sandstone has a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.92 kilojoules per kilogram per degree Fahrenheit, meaning it takes a meaningful and sustained energy input to raise its temperature. But once raised, it releases that energy at an equally sustained rate. The combined mass of the two crevice walls in contact with a living space, conservatively estimated at 80,000 pounds, represented a thermal reservoir that the small stove could maintain with roughly 4 to 5 hours of active burning per day, rather than the 10 to 12 hours of near-continuous burning required to keep a standard valley cabin livable in the same conditions. The single constructed wall at the front, the only surface bleeding heat to the outside, measured just 56 square feet of exposed area. A standard cabin of the period exposed between 800 and 1,000 square feet of wall, ceiling, and floor surface to the cold. Callum's structure was losing heat through roughly 6% of the surface area that his neighbors' homes were losing it through. The wind that drove the cold into every crack and crevice of the valley floor did not reach his door. The crevice entrance deflected it upward and around. On the worst nights, when gusts in the valley measured somewhere between 35 and 45 miles per hour according to later accounts, the air movement at the crevice entrance was barely perceptible, a whisper where the valley floor was screaming. Then January came. And January of 1887 in Montana was something else entirely. The great die-up arrived without warning and without mercy. A brief mid-January thaw, just warm enough to melt the surface layer of snow, was followed within 48 hours by a catastrophic temperature crash and a blizzard that deposited between 2 and 4 feet of new snow across the territory and then sealed it under a layer of ice as the temperature plunged back to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit and below. Cattle by the hundreds of thousands had no access to grass, no shelter adequate to the conditions, and no reserves left after the December cold snap. They died in draws and coulees across the territory, stacked against fence lines where they had drifted seeking shelter that wasn't there. The human population fared better, but not without serious hardship. Several families in the valley burned through their entire winter wood supply before the end of January and were forced to begin dismantling outbuildings and furniture for fuel. 2 families consolidated into a single cabin to share body heat and reduce the surface area they were trying to keep warm, an improvised acknowledgement of the very principle Callum had engineered into his structure from the beginning. The crevice cabin did not change. The rock did not panic. The stove burned its 4 to 5 hours each evening, charged the walls, and the walls released heat through the night. When the blizzard was at its worst, when the valley below was a wall of white noise and frozen chaos, the temperature inside Callum Dreas Crevice held between 48 degrees Fahrenheit and 57 degrees Fahrenheit on the coldest nights, maintained by stone that had been slowly, patiently storing energy since the first fire of November. He did not run out of wood. He did not dismantle anything. He waited, as he had always waited, for the land to show him what it would do. And when it had finished showing him, he was still warm. Spring came late to Montana in 1887. It always did, but that year it arrived with a particular weight behind it, the weight of what winter had taken. The draws and coulees were full of cattle that hadn't made it. The valley fields that had looked so promising the previous summer were trampled flat, covered in the residue of a season that had asked more than most people or animals were prepared to give. There was a quiet in the community that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite embarrassment. It was the specific silence of people who had miscalculated something serious and were not yet ready to name it. The wood situation was perhaps the most immediate measure of that miscalculation. At least 3 families in the valley had exhausted their winter fuel supply before February's end. A 4th had come within days of doing so. One family had pulled apart their storage shed board by board and fed it into the stove through the final weeks of January. Another had burned fence posts. The physical evidence of the winter's severity was not written in the snow. That was melting, but in the gaps where outbuildings used to stand and in the stacks of furniture pushed against walls because the pieces they used to hold had been sacrificed to the fire. Ernest Pratt was among the first to make the walk up to the crevice after the thaw was solid enough to make the ridge trail safe. He brought 2 other men with him, a homesteader named Douglas Farrell, who had spent the winter burning through wood at a rate that had genuinely frightened him by March, and Josiah Crane, the builder, who had said the least publicly about Callum's project since November and had, by all indications, been thinking about it the most. What they found when they stepped through that narrow door in the rock face was not dramatic. There was no spectacle. The interior was dim, compact, and smelled of wood smoke and pine. The stove sat in the back corner against the stone, a modest cast-iron box that any of them would have considered underpowered for a Montana winter. The walls were rock, not constructed, not chinked, not insulated in any conventional sense, just the raw face of the ridge extending from floor to ceiling on both sides. The sod roof overhead was already showing the first green of spring growth, grass taking hold in the 14 inches of packed earth above the log frame. Josiah Crane walked the length of the interior without speaking. He pressed his hand flat against the south-facing rock wall, the one that caught the morning light through the small window, and held it there. Then he pressed his hand against the back wall, where the stove faced. He looked at the distance between the stove and the stone. He looked at the single small facade wall at the entrance, the only piece of constructed surface in the entire structure. He calculated, silently, the ratio of what Callum had built to what the mountain had already provided. According to Pratt's journal, Crane stood at the entrance for a long moment before he turned around and said, simply, "I've been building the wrong thing for 4 years." It was not a common kind of admission from a man of Crane's standing in the community, but it was an honest one, and it opened a conversation that lasted well into that spring and summer. The questions came methodically, the way practical men ask practical questions. How had Callum managed the drainage? He showed them the shallow channel cut along the base of both rock walls, directing melt water to the threshold and out. How had the draft held through the worst of the blizzard nights? He explained the geometry, the narrowing crevice above the entrance creating consistent upward draw, the rock faces above deflecting the northwest wind away from the chimney opening. How much wood total for the entire winter? That answer stopped the room. Callum Dreyist had burned approximately 2¼ cords of wood between early November and the end of March, a period of roughly 20 weeks. The valley average, based on what the men present knew of their own consumption and that of their neighbors, had run between 4½ and 6 cords for the same period, in structures that had still struggled to maintain livable interior temperatures during the worst cold events. Douglas Farrell, who had burned closer to 6 cords and still dismantled part of his smokehouse for fuel in January, did the arithmetic quietly. Callum had used less than half the wood, in a winter that had nearly broken the valley. The physics behind that number were not mysterious, once laid out plainly. 2 constructed surfaces lose heat. 100% of exterior thermal loss in Callum's cabin occurred through that single 8-foot facade at the entrance. The rock walls on either side, totaling more than 80,000 pounds of continuous sandstone, lost no heat to the outside because they were the outside. They were the mountain. You cannot heat a mountain, but you can use it as a battery, and that is precisely what the stove against the back wall had been doing every evening since November. The sod roof, 14 inches of packed earth and root system, provided thermal mass overhead comparable to a well-constructed masonry ceiling. Standard valley roofs, covered in split wood or bark, lost heat upward almost as readily as they shed snow. The sod held it, and the wind that had accelerated through the valley floor and driven cold air through every gap in every chink of every log wall down below, had never reached the door. By midsummer of 1887, Josiah Crane had begun construction on a new structure for a family on the eastern end of the valley. It was not a crevice cabin. There were no suitable rock formations in that location, but it incorporated several principles he had taken from what he saw that spring morning. The new structure used a natural earthen bank as one full wall, cut into a low hillside rather than built freestanding. The hearth was positioned against the earth contact wall rather than at the center of the room. A thick sod roof replaced the standard split wood covering. The exposed facade faced slightly south of east. It was not identical to what Callum had done. It couldn't be. The site was different, the materials were different, the constraints are different. But the logic was the same. Use what the land already is before you build what you think it needs to be. Local accounts suggest that at least 4 other families in the wider valley area made meaningful modifications to their existing structures in the 2 years following the winter of 1886 to 1887, adding earth berms against exterior walls, replacing wood roofing with sod, repositioning stoves closer to stone or earth contact surfaces. None of these changes were dramatic. All of them, according to the informal records kept by Pratt and others, resulted in measurable reductions in winter fuel consumption and noticeable improvements in overnight temperature retention. The idea did not spread with the speed of revelation. It spread the way practical knowledge always spreads in communities that live close to the ground, slowly, observation by observation, winter by winter, one conversation at a time. But it spread. There's a question worth sitting with at the end of this story, and it is not a sentimental one. It is an engineering question dressed in historical clothing, and it goes like this. Why did it take a catastrophic winter to make experienced builders look at what one man had understood before he broke a single piece of ground? The answer is partly about habit and partly about the nature of expertise. Josiah Crane knew how to build cabins. He had built 7 of them, and all 7 were standing. In the context of normal Montana winters, hard, yes, but survivable with effort and adequate wood supply, his method worked well enough. The system was not broken badly enough to demand reinvention. It was only when the great die-up arrived, when the margin between adequate and inadequate collapsed entirely, that the difference between Crane's approach and Callum's became impossible to dismiss. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly across the history of vernacular architecture. The practical building traditions developed by people living directly with the consequences of their construction choices. Solutions that look primitive or eccentric from the outside frequently contain engineering logic that formal training either never arrived at or gradually abandoned in favor of standardized methods that prioritize speed and reproducibility over site-specific performance. Callum Dreyest was not an architect. He was a miner who had spent a decade underground learning, by direct physical experience, what stone does with heat over time. He brought that knowledge to a landscape that was full of stone and applied it in the most literal way possible. He put the stone between himself and the weather. The principles at work in his Crevice cabin have modern names and modern measurements attached to them. Thermal mass, the capacity of a dense material to absorb, store, and slowly release thermal energy, is now a standard consideration in passive house design and energy-efficient construction. The concept of minimizing exposed surface area to reduce thermal loss is fundamental to contemporary building envelope theory. The use of earth-sheltered construction, built into hillsides, banked against natural formations, covered with sod or packed earth, has been documented across cultures and centuries, from the sod houses of the Great Plains to the barabaras of Alaska's Aleutian Islands to the partially subterranean dwellings of Norse Greenland. What Callum did was not unique in human history. It was unique in his valley, in his moment, because the knowledge that would have made it obvious had not traveled with the settlers who came west from the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region. They brought a building tradition suited to a different climate and never fully adapted it to the one they found. The numbers his Crevice cabin produced are worth stating plainly one final time, because they are not trivial. 2¼ cords of wood for a full Montana winter, in a year that broke the open-range cattle industry of the American West. Interior temperatures holding between 48 degrees Fahrenheit and 57 degrees Fahrenheit through the worst nights of the Great Die-Up, maintained by stone walls storing heat from 4 to 5 hours of daily burning. A single constructed wall of 56 square feet, roughly 6% of the thermal envelope surface area of a comparable standard cabin, as the only point of heat loss to the outside. A draft that held steady through 40-mile-per-hour blizzards because the mountain above the entrance deflected the wind before it could reach the chimney. These results did not require modern materials. They did not require electricity, insulation bats, vapor barriers, or engineered lumber. They required observation, patience, and a willingness to let the land solve most of the problem before picking up a tool. That is the part that tends to get lost when people talk about frontier survival. The story we tell most often is about toughness, about men and women who endured brutal conditions through sheer force of will and physical labor. And that story is true, but it is incomplete, because the people who survived best on the frontier were not always the ones who worked the hardest against the land. They were frequently the ones who had learned to work least against it, who had figured out, through observation or inheritance or hard experience, how to make the land do the work that sweat and timber and fire could not sustain alone. Callum Dreas spent a season watching before he built anything. He watched the wind move through terrain. He watched snow accumulate in sheltered places. He pressed his hands against warm granite in the dark and understood something about patience and mass and time that no amount of additional log splitting would have taught him. He did not fight the winter. He borrowed the mountain's indifference to it. And the mountain, as it turned out, was very good at being cold-proof. It had been practicing for 10,000 years. There is something in that worth carrying forward, not as nostalgia for a harder life, but as a reminder that intelligence applied to place, to material, to the specific behavior of wind and stone and cold, has always been the deepest form of shelter. The tools change. The principles don't. If this kind of forgotten frontier engineering is what you come here for, hit like, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There are more stories like this, one buried in the history of the American frontier, solutions that looked like stubbornness until the first hard winter proved them right. We'll keep finding them.